By the summer of 1916, Europe had already endured nearly 2 years of unrelenting war. From the English Channel to the Swiss frontier, the Western Front had hardened into a landscape of mud, wire, and despair. Millions of men faced each other from parallel trenches, fighting not for territory so much as survival. Each side sought a breakthrough that might restore movement to the stalemated conflict. For the Allies, particularly Britain and France, that hope would focus on a stretch of river valley in northern France, along the meandering Somme. The offensive planned there would become one of the most infamous in modern history, a symbol of both heroism and futility, of courage crushed beneath industrial warfare. The Battle of the Somme was conceived in the crucible of desperation. The French army was bleeding at Verdun, where the German High Command had launched a colossal assault intended to bleed France white. To relieve pressure on their ally, the British Expeditionary Force agreed to mount a major offensive further north. Originally, the Somme attack was to be a joint Franco-British effort, with the French providing the majority of troops and artillery. But by June 1916, Verdun had consumed so much of France's strength that the British, under General Sir Douglas Haig, were forced to take the lead. For the first time, Britain's new mass army, formed from volunteers inspired by patriotism and propaganda, would bear the brunt of a major offensive. Haig, a cavalry officer by training, believed deeply in the offensive spirit and in the power of a coordinated assault to break through enemy lines. The plan envisioned a massive preliminary bombardment lasting several days, followed by waves of infantry advancing across no man's land to capture the German trenches. The British High Command was confident that their artillery would destroy enemy barbed wire, crush dugouts, and demoralize defenders. "Not even a rat will be left alive," one officer reportedly assured his men. The soldiers, many of whom had never before faced combat, trusted that the barrage would protect them. They were young, enthusiastic, and largely untested. Clerks, miners, school teachers, and factory hands transformed into soldiers. They would soon discover the brutal reality of modern war. For the Germans, the Somme front was part of a deeply entrenched defensive system developed over months of careful engineering. The front line consisted of multiple trench networks, fortified with concrete bunkers, machine gun nests, and deep shelters up to 30 feet underground. These defenses were designed not only to withstand bombardment, but to funnel attackers into deadly killing zones. German intelligence had observed the Allied preparations and anticipated the assault. Their positions were ready, their artillery pre-registered, and their machine guns carefully sighted. On June 24, 1916, the Allied artillery opened fire. For 7 days and nights, more than 1.5 million shells rained down on the German lines. The noise was constant, a thunder that shook the earth and was heard miles away. Men waiting in the trenches described the bombardment as apocalyptic. The sky flashed red and white, and the ground trembled like a living thing. To the British command, this seemed proof that the enemy was being annihilated. But many shells were defective or too light to penetrate the deep German shelters. The bombardment churned up the ground but left the barbed wire largely intact. When the guns finally fell silent at 7:30 a.m. on July 1st, tens of thousands of British soldiers climbed from their trenches into a haze of smoke and mist, expecting to walk unopposed into ruined enemy lines. The moment they rose, the illusion shattered. German machine guns, untouched and perfectly operational, opened fire. The killing began almost instantly. Across the front, entire battalions were mowed down within minutes. The men of the PALS battalions, units made up of friends, neighbors, and co-workers who had enlisted together, fell together. In places like Serre, Gaumecourt, and Beaumont-Hamel, the first waves never reached the enemy wire. Those who did found it uncut, tangling them in deadly traps as bullets tore through the air. In some sectors, communication lines were destroyed, leaving officers unaware that neighboring units had been annihilated. The advance continued nonetheless, driven by orders that no longer matched reality. By evening, the magnitude of the disaster began to emerge. Of the roughly 120,000 British troops who attacked on the first day, nearly 60,000 were casualties, 20,000 of them dead. It was the single bloodiest day in the history of the British Army. Haig and his staff, stunned but determined, decided to continue the offensive. They believed the enemy must also be near breaking point, that persistence would eventually yield victory. But for the soldiers on the ground, the Somme had already become a nightmare. Letters from survivors paint a picture of disbelief and horror. Men wrote of comrades cut to pieces by machine gun fire, of bodies lying tangled in wire, of wounded crying out for water through the night. One private recalled walking back over ground, so thick with dead that we could hardly step without treading on them. Others spoke of the unbearable smell, the flies, and the sense of helplessness as attacks failed again and again. Yet, despite the carnage, the offensive continued for months. Each new assault was promised as the one that would finally break the German line. Each ended much the same way, in slaughter and stalemate. The Somme campaign was not merely a battle. It was a test of endurance between industrial nations. Haig's army, inexperienced but determined, faced Germany's veterans in a contest of attrition that would stretch into November. The British would learn lessons in blood about the coordination of artillery and infantry, the importance of communication, and the sheer resilience of the enemy. The Germans, for their part, would realize that the British Army had come of age, capable of sustaining an offensive of unprecedented scale. But for the men in the trenches, these abstractions meant little. Their world was a landscape of mud, death, and ceaseless noise. As July wore on, small successes were achieved at tremendous cost. Villages like Mametz and Montauban were captured, their names becoming milestones in the grinding advance. Rain turned the battlefield into a quagmire. Artillery churned the soil into a soup of mud and blood, swallowing men and horses alike. The stench of decay hung over everything. Yet reinforcements kept coming, and the guns never ceased. The British Army was learning, adapting under fire. But every lesson was paid for with thousands of lives. By mid-July, the offensive expanded. The newly arrived tanks, a secret weapon making their first appearance, offered hope of a breakthrough. Though few in number and plagued by mechanical failures, their mere presence signaled a new era in warfare. Men cheered as the strange iron beasts lumbered forward, crushing wire and terrorizing defenders. But the terrain of the Somme, cratered and sodden, proved too harsh for early machines. Many broke down or became stuck, Those that reached the enemy lines found themselves isolated and destroyed. The dream of an armored revolution would have to wait. The Somme became a vortex, drawing in ever more men and material. The French army, though reduced in numbers, continued to fight alongside the British on the southern sector, achieving some success near Péronne. The Germans, realizing the danger, poured reinforcements into the front, determined not to yield. Villages changed hands multiple times, each assault consuming entire divisions. From above, observation balloons and primitive aircraft guided artillery fire and photographed the devastation below. The landscape, once fields and forests, became an alien wasteland. As July turned to August, the Battle of the Somme entered its second month, and what had begun as an ambitious attempt to break through the German lines devolved into a drawn-out struggle of exhaustion. The optimism that had fueled the first assaults had vanished, replaced by a grim acceptance that progress would be measured not in miles but in yards, and purchased at a terrible price. Both armies dug in deeper, their trenches expanding into complex networks of communication lines, dugouts, and gun positions. The Somme front became a living organism of mud, blood, and smoke, where the landscape itself seemed to resist every human effort to impose order. For the British High Command, the logic of attrition took hold. General Haig believed that continuous pressure would eventually wear down the enemy's strength, even if each attack yielded only marginal gains. In his mind, the Somme was not a single battle, but a campaign designed to drain the German army until it could no longer sustain the war. This strategy, while arguably rational in a conflict of industrial scale, translated on the ground into endless assaults that destroyed regiments faster than they could be replaced. For the soldiers, the war of attrition was not a theory. It was a daily experience of terror and endurance. Throughout July and August, the British launched a series of assaults along the front. Villages such as Longueval, Bazentin-les-Petits, and Delville Wood became focal points of combat, their names etched into the memories of the men who fought there. Each attack began with massive artillery bombardments intended to obliterate German defenses. Yet, time and again, when the shelling lifted, machine guns emerged from the ruins, spitting fire into the advancing ranks. The Germans had perfected a system of flexible defense, retreating to secondary positions and counterattacking once the bombardment ended. The British, learning at great cost, began to adjust their tactics, shorter barrages, creeping artillery fire that moved forward just ahead of the infantry, better coordination between guns and men. But the price of each lesson was steep. Life in the trenches during this period defies simple description. The constant rain turned the battlefield into a swamp. Soldiers trudged through knee-deep mud that clung to boots and uniforms, carrying with it the stench of decay. Dead bodies, long unburied, surfaced after bombardments, their forms unrecognizable. Rats grew fat on the remains, swarming through trenches at night. Lice infested clothing, causing relentless itching and sores. Food was often cold and scarce. Tea brewed from muddy water the only comfort. Shell fire was incessant, its sound shaping every waking moment. Even when the guns paused, men heard the phantom echoes in their minds, a haunting silence broken by distant cries or the hiss of incoming shells. Letters from the Somme reflect a weary stoicism that bordered on disbelief. Soldiers wrote home not of glory, but of endurance. "We go over tomorrow," one corporal wrote to his wife. "We shall do our best. I hope I shall come through." Many such letters arrived long after their writers had been killed. Chaplains, medics, and stretcher-bearers worked tirelessly amid chaos, pulling the wounded from shell holes, comforting the dying. The scale of suffering was beyond comprehension, yet camaraderie persisted. Men shared cigarettes, jokes, and memories of home. Small acts of defiance against a world that seemed to have gone mad. August brought no relief. The front lines shifted by mere hundreds of yards, yet every small advance was trumpeted in newspapers as a victory. On the ground, the cost was staggering. The capture of Delville Wood, for example, was achieved only after 6 weeks of continuous fighting. The South African Brigade, sent to take the position, was reduced from 3,000 men to fewer than 800. In the north, Canadian and Australian troops joined the struggle, bringing fresh energy and new tactics. Their courage became legendary, but even their determination could not overcome the machine gun's dominance. At Pozieres and Mouquet Farm, entire battalions were decimated. Survivors described the ground as a desert of shell holes, where the living and the dead shared the same mud. The German soldiers suffered no less. Their trenches, once strongholds of defense, became death traps under constant bombardment. Supplies were scarce. Food arrived stale or rotten. The psychological strain of continuous shelling, the dreaded Trommelfeuer or drum fire, was unbearable. Men emerged from dugouts half-mad, trembling uncontrollably. Yet discipline held. German counterattacks were fierce and often successful, driven by pride and the belief that holding the Somme line was vital to Germany's survival. Letters from the German side mirror those of their British foes. Exhaustion, fear, and an unshakable sense that the war had become an inescapable nightmare. By late August, Haig shifted his focus south toward the high ground of Guillemont and Ginchy, believing that capturing these positions would open a path toward Péronne. The attacks were preceded by another enormous artillery bombardment, this time employing creeping barrages more effectively. The Irish divisions, including the 16th Irish and 36th Ulster, fought with remarkable bravery in this sector, capturing objectives despite devastating losses. Their shared suffering at the Somme would become a rare symbol of unity across Ireland's political and religious divide. A poignant reminder that the war's human cost transcended national and sectarian boundaries. Meanwhile, technological innovation began to alter the dynamics of battle. Aircraft played an increasingly important role, conducting reconnaissance and directing artillery fire. Dogfights between British and German pilots became common sights above the trenches, a deadly ballet fought in fragile biplanes. On the ground, engineers experimented with new means of overcoming the obstacles of trench warfare. Tanks had first appeared in September, but now commanders sought ways to integrate them more effectively. Each new weapon brought hope of breaking the stalemate, yet the war's logic remained stubbornly resistant. For every innovation, there was a countermeasure. For every gain, an equal loss. By early September, the Somme battlefield had consumed nearly 500,000 Allied troops and an estimated 400,000 Germans. The once quiet farmlands were now a moonscape of craters and shattered trees. The river Somme itself had disappeared under the mud, its waters mixed with the debris of war. Commanders continued to plan assaults, searching for the elusive breakthrough that might justify the sacrifice. The soldiers, obedient and numb, prepared to go over the top once more. The Battle of the Somme had long since ceased to be a single event. It had become a state of existence. Men lived from attack to attack, from one bombardment to the next. The front lines, churned beyond recognition, blurred distinctions between attacker and defender. Every gain was provisional, every victory temporary. As the summer waned, rumors spread that the offensive would soon end, that winter would bring respite. But the orders kept coming, and the guns kept firing. Among the soldiers, a kind of fatalism took hold. Death was no longer an abstraction, but a companion. Expected and almost routine. Yet, alongside despair, there was also resilience. Units shattered one day were reformed the next. Replacements arrived to fill the ranks. The war machine kept turning. The sense of duty, drilled into every man, persisted even as belief in the cause waned. "We go on," one officer wrote in his diary. "We have no choice. It is the only way." By the beginning of September 1916, the British were preparing for a renewed effort. Buoyed by reinforcements and growing American sympathy abroad, Haig still believed that one more push might finally break the German lines. The soldiers, weary but obedient, readied themselves for another round of fire and blood. Ahead of them lay the villages of Flers and Courcelette, where new tactics and machines would once again test the limits of human endurance. By September 1916, the Somme offensive had become a colossal experiment in modern warfare. For the generals at headquarters, it was a test of endurance, of men, machines, and morale. For the soldiers on the ground, it was something else entirely, a test of survival in a world stripped of sense or mercy. The battlefield, once the heart of rural France, was now a blasted wilderness of shattered villages and cratered fields, a place where nothing grew and nothing was whole. It was into this ruin that the British command prepared its next major assault, convinced that one more concerted effort might finally crack the German line. The new offensive, launched on September 15th, would become infamous for the debut of a revolutionary weapon: the tank. These armored vehicles, strange, smoke-belching monsters of steel, had been developed in secrecy and promised to overcome the obstacles that had stymied every previous attack. Clad in metal plates and armed with machine guns, they could roll over wire, cross trenches, and provide mobile cover for advancing infantry. The plan at Flers-Courcelette was to use them in conjunction with a creeping artillery barrage, a combination of mobility and firepower that might at last restore movement to the front. At dawn, the assault began. As the guns lifted, the first tanks lurched forward, astonishing the German defenders. The machines crushed through barbed wire and rumbled into enemy positions, their noise and appearance inspiring awe and terror alike. Some soldiers cheered, others stared in disbelief. Yet the tanks were still primitive, slow, cumbersome, and mechanically fragile. Many broke down before reaching the line. Those that did reach the enemy often became stuck in shell holes or immobilized by artillery fire. Despite their limitations, the tanks achieved localized success. The village of Flers fell, and British troops advanced farther in a single day than they had in the previous 2 months. But the momentum could not be sustained. Once again, communication broke down. Reserves lagged behind, and German counterattacks reclaimed much of the ground. Still, the psychological impact was profound. The tank, though flawed, represented the future, a glimpse of a new kind of war. It embodied the growing mechanization of combat, where technology replaced heroism and machines replaced men as the arbiters of fate. Haig hailed them as a decisive instrument, yet it would take years before the technology matured. For now, they were as much symbol as weapon, proof that even amid despair, innovation continued. The autumn rains soon returned, transforming the battlefield into a sea of mud. Every shell hole became a miniature pond, every trench a swamp. Soldiers waded waist-deep through muck that sucked at their boots and swallowed the fallen. The smell of death mingled with that of wet earth and cordite. "The Somme," wrote one British officer, "is not a place, it is a condition of the soul." Men who had survived months of bombardment began to break down. Some trembled uncontrollably, unable to speak or move. The army called it shell shock, a term that failed to capture the depth of their torment. Medical officers treated it as a nervous disorder, often sending victims back to the front once they could stand. Compassion was rare. Endurance was demanded. By late September, the Canadian Corps entered the battle, bringing with them a reputation for determination and discipline. At Courcelette, they fought with ferocity, capturing the village and repelling multiple counterattacks. The success, however, came at terrible cost. Thousands dead and wounded. Nearby, Australian troops assaulted the fortified positions of Thiepval Ridge and Mouquet Farm, enduring ceaseless shell fire and counterattacks. The courage displayed by these units became legendary, yet the human toll was unsustainable. For every yard gained, lives were spent like currency in an economy of despair. As the weeks dragged on, the nature of the battle changed. It was no longer about seizing objectives, but about maintaining pressure, ensuring that the Germans could not shift forces to other fronts. Haig's strategy of attrition seemed both logical and monstrous. Logical, because Germany's manpower reserves were finite. Monstrous, because every step forward required thousands of deaths. The British Army had entered the war as an expeditionary force of professionals. By autumn 1916, it had become a vast citizen army, baptized in fire. The lessons of the Somme were written in blood, but would shape tactics for the rest of the war. Artillery coordination improved, air reconnaissance became indispensable, and infantry began using smaller, more flexible formations. Progress was slow, but evolution was real. The German army, for its part, faced growing strain, casualties mounted, and morale faltered. The once confident defenders were now fighting with dwindling supplies and constant exhaustion. Yet they adapted, constructing new defensive lines farther back, the so-called Hindenburg Line, that could absorb attacks and minimize losses. Their commanders recognized that the Somme, though costly, had also inflicted unbearable damage on their enemy. Both sides emerged diminished, neither victorious. The war had become a contest of endurance between two industrial machines grinding one another down. Behind the lines, the contrast between home and front grew ever more jarring. In Britain, newspapers published upbeat communiques, emphasizing progress and heroism while concealing the scale of loss. Posters urged civilians to buy war bonds and keep the home fires burning. Families received telegrams bearing simple, devastating messages. Regret to inform you, entire communities were hollowed out. The PALS battalions, which had drawn recruits from the same towns and factories, now left entire streets of widows and grieving parents. The war's cost was no longer measured in strategy, but in human absence. For the soldiers who endured the Somme, time lost meaning. The constant rhythm of bombardment and attack blurred days into one another. Sleep was scarce, dreams haunted by the dead. Letters home became talismans of normality. Many tried to describe what they saw, but words failed. "You cannot imagine," one private wrote, "unless you have been through it. It is like the end of the world." Others turned inward, retreating into silence. The war was remaking them, stripping away innocence and illusion. The idealism of 1914 had long since drowned in the mud. By October, the weather worsened. Rain turned into sleet. The ground hardened with frost. The offensive ground on toward the villages of Le Sarre and Aucourt-l'Abbé, where resistance was fierce. Each attack yielded little more than a line of ruined buildings and a fresh list of casualties. Medical facilities behind the front overflowed with the wounded. Stretchers littered the roads. Field hospitals operated around the clock. The wounded spoke of comrades buried alive, of men who vanished into the mud without a trace. Yet, despite the horror, the army machine persisted, feeding, organizing, replacing, as though human life were just another supply to be expended. In November, the final phase of the battle approached. Haig, under pressure from London, sought one last push before winter made operations impossible. The objective was modest: capture the ridges around the village of Beaumont-Hamel. The artillery thundered once more, echoing across the wasteland. On November 13th, British and Canadian troops advanced through freezing rain and fog. This time, better planning and coordination yielded success. German defenses crumbled under precise bombardment, and some positions were taken with fewer casualties than before. Yet, the victory was hollow. After 141 days of combat, the front line had moved only about 6 miles at its deepest point. As snow began to fall, the Somme fell silent. The offensive that had begun with dreams of a breakthrough ended as it had begun, in stalemate. Both sides were shattered, and neither had achieved its aims. The British had demonstrated their growing strength and resilience, but at a cost of nearly 420,000 casualties. The French lost another 200,000, while German losses exceeded 450,000. The valley of the Somme had consumed over 1 million men. When reports reached Britain, public reaction was mixed. Some saw the battle as a necessary sacrifice, a step toward eventual victory. Others began to question the general's competence and the logic of the war itself. Newspapers published casualty lists so long that they filled entire pages. In private, even Haig's subordinates doubted whether the price had been worth the gain. Yet the commander-in-chief remained convinced that the Somme had drained Germany's strength and paved the way for victory in 1918. History would judge his claim with ambivalence. For the soldiers who survived, there was no question of meaning, only endurance. They had lived through hell and returned changed. The Somme had taught them that modern war was not a matter of courage or will, but of machinery and mass. They had seen bravery rendered meaningless by artillery, skill obliterated by chance. What remained was solidarity, the bond between men who shared the trenches, who kept each other alive through laughter, habit, and sheer stubbornness. In that bond, fragile and fleeting, lay the only redemption the Somme could offer. When the last guns fell silent along the Somme in late November 1916, the men who remained scarcely recognized the land they had fought over. The once green valley was a desolation of mud and shell holes, where broken trees jutted like bones from the earth, and villages existed only as piles of brick and timber. Horses lay half-buried in the muck beside shattered wagons, and the air carried the mingled smells of cordite, decay, and winter rain. For those who had survived, there was little sense of victory. The line had moved forward only a few miles, and no decisive breakthrough had come. Yet the battle had already entered legend, as both a symbol of endurance and a warning of the terrible price of modern war. The soldiers who trudged back from the front were older than their years. Many had lost comrades who had shared every hardship since training. Others returned wounded in body or mind. Some could no longer speak of what they had seen. Shell shock, a term barely understood at the time, afflicted thousands. Men flinched at loud noises, suffered nightmares, or withdrew into silence. Military discipline demanded that they continue, and many did. But a part of them remained in the trenches forever. For countless families across Britain and the Commonwealth, telegrams and casualty lists delivered the grim news that sons and fathers would never come home. Towns that had sent whole battalions to the Somme now counted their losses in the hundreds. In streets where the pals had lived side by side, the silence of absence was its own memorial. The psychological burden extended far beyond the battlefield. The Somme shattered illusions about the nature of war. It exposed the limits of courage in the face of industrial killing, the impotence of heroism against machines. For centuries, warfare had been portrayed as an arena of honor and valor. The Somme reduced it to mechanical annihilation. Soldiers had obeyed orders, fought bravely, and died in numbers too vast to comprehend, often without seeing the enemy who killed them. The very scale of the slaughter made meaning impossible. When survivors returned home, many found that civilians could not understand what they had endured. The gap between those who had fought and those who had not widened into a gulf that would haunt post-war society. Yet, the military leadership insisted that the Somme had not been in vain. General Haig defended the campaign as a necessary step in wearing down the German army, claiming that it had forced the enemy to divert resources from Verdun and had demonstrated the growing power of Britain's new armies. In purely strategic terms, there was truth in this. Germany had indeed suffered enormous losses and would soon adopt a more defensive posture behind the newly constructed Hindenburg Line. But for the men who had fought, such reasoning offered little comfort. They measured success not in lines on a map, but in lives lost. The argument that the Somme had paved the way to eventual victory sounded hollow amid the graves that stretched as far as the eye could see. Those graves became the enduring landscape of remembrance. Across the Somme Valley, cemeteries rose where once the trenches had been. Each was marked by rows of identical white stones, their uniformity a quiet acknowledgement of equality in death. At Thiepval, the memorial to the missing would later bear the names of more than 72,000 soldiers who had no known grave. Families visited the battlefields, walking among the ruins and trying to imagine where their sons had fallen. Pilgrimages became acts of collective mourning, binding nations in grief. The Somme was no longer just a place. It was a wound carved into memory. In the decades that followed, the battle's legacy continued to shape how the world understood the First World War. Writers and poets sought to capture the unutterable horror. Siegfried Sassoon and Wilfred Owen, both veterans of the Western Front, turned their experiences into verses that stripped away patriotic illusion. Their poems spoke not of glory, but of pity and waste, the monstrous anger of the guns, the shrill, demented choirs of wailing shells. Artists like Paul Nash and C.R.W. Nevinson painted the devastated landscapes in stark lines and muted colors, transforming destruction into modernist expression. Through art and literature, the Somme became not just a historical event, but a symbol of a generation's loss of faith in progress, in leadership, and sometimes in humanity itself. The battle also marked a turning point in military thought. The lessons learned, at terrible cost, reshaped strategy and technology. Commanders began to appreciate the necessity of combined arms, the coordination of artillery, infantry, tanks, and aircraft. Communications improved, reconnaissance became systematic, and logistics evolved to sustain mass armies over long campaigns. The mistakes of the Somme forced innovation that would later bear fruit in 1918, when the Allies finally achieved the breakthroughs that ended the war. In that sense, the Somme was both tragedy and teacher, a grim apprenticeship in modern war. But perhaps its deepest impact lay in the realm of memory. For the British people, the Somme came to define the Great War as a whole. It embodied both the nobility of sacrifice and the futility of the struggle. Every July 1st, the anniversary of the first day, veterans and families gathered to honor the fallen. The names of distant villages, Thiepval, Beaumont-Hamel, Delville Wood, entered the national vocabulary as synonyms for courage and loss. In France, the memory intertwined with that of Verdun. Together, they symbolized endurance against impossible odds. Even in Germany, the Somme was remembered with grim respect as the battle that tested the army's soul. Yet, over time, the meaning of the Somme evolved. In the interwar years, it became a touchstone for pacifism, cited by those who sought to prevent another catastrophe. The phrase "lions led by donkeys" entered popular usage, capturing the belief that brave soldiers had been sacrificed by incompetent generals. Films and memoirs reinforced this interpretation, turning the Somme into a parable of waste and mismanagement. Later, historians would challenge that view, arguing that the generals had faced unprecedented conditions and that the war's industrial nature left few alternatives. Still, the emotional truth of the soldiers' experience remained undeniable. Whatever the strategic rationale, the human cost was beyond justification. The Somme's influence reached far beyond the battlefield. It changed how societies mourned and how they imagined the nation. The scale of loss made traditional rituals of grief inadequate. New forms of commemoration arose to honor not the individual hero, but the collective sacrifice. The concept of the unknown soldier, buried with ceremony, to represent all who had fallen without trace, originated in the aftermath of the war. Public silence, 2 minutes of reflection, became the most eloquent expression of remembrance. In that silence, people found unity where politics and ideology had failed. For the soldiers themselves, remembrance was more personal. Many struggled to reconcile their survival with the memory of those who had not returned. They formed associations, wrote letters, and revisited the battlefields, seeking closure that often eluded them. Some found solace in fellowship. Others retreated from society altogether. The war had given them an identity that peace could not replace. In their later years, when they spoke of the Somme, it was often with a quiet mix of pride and sorrow, a pride in endurance, a sorrow for the price. The land, too, bore witness. Farmers who returned after the war found their fields littered with shrapnel and bones. Even decades later, the iron harvest continued, shells and fragments unearthed by plows each spring. Memorials and preserved trenches dotted the countryside, silent reminders that beneath the grass lay another world. Tourists and historians walked the same ground, trying to understand what had happened there, how ordinary men had endured the unimaginable. The Somme became not just a battlefield, but a pilgrimage site, where past and present met in uneasy conversation. In a larger sense, the Somme encapsulated the paradox of the 20th century, the coexistence of technological progress and moral regression. It demonstrated how industrial power, once celebrated as the engine of civilization, could become the instrument of destruction. The same factories that built locomotives and ships had produced shells and machine guns. The same science that promised prosperity had devised gas and explosives. The Somme was where the modern age confronted its own shadow. More than a century later, the battle remains a defining episode in the collective memory of the nations that fought there. Its statistics are well known. Over 1 million casualties in 141 days. But numbers cannot convey its meaning. The Somme endures not because of what was gained, but because of what was lost. It stands as a testament to human endurance under inhuman conditions, to the capacity for courage amid chaos. And it warns, silently and eternally, of the consequences when ambition and fear outweigh compassion and reason. To walk the fields of the Somme today is to step into history's echo chamber. The air is still, the earth gentle again, but beneath the quiet lies a chorus of ghosts. Their story is not merely one of tragedy, but of transformation. The moment when the modern world was forged in mud and fire. The men who fought there did not know they were shaping history. They sought only to survive another day. Yet in their endurance, they left behind a lesson that transcends time. That war, once unleashed, consumes more than armies. It devours the very fabric of humanity. The Battle of the Somme ended in November 1916, but its reverberations have never ceased. Every generation that studies it confronts the same questions. How could such slaughter have been justified? What does courage mean when it achieves so little? And what, if anything, can be learned from so vast a tragedy? The answers may shift with time, but the questions remain. The Somme is not merely a chapter in history. It is a mirror held up to the human condition, reflecting both our capacity for endurance and our propensity for destruction.